Some people don't leave because they stop loving life. They leave because they believe life has already forgotten them. Before the first streak of dawn touched the prairie, Grace Holloway sold the last thing she owned, folded a faded receipt into her coat pocket, and walked away from the little frontier town without looking back. The wooden church bell rang once behind her, but she never slowed her pace. Every storefront remained dark. Every window stayed closed. Not a single soul noticed she was leaving forever. Or so she believed. Nearly half a mile beyond town, where the dirt road stretched across endless fields of golden grass, a lonely cowboy leaned against an old fence, quietly watching her disappear into the morning mist. Luke Ashford had spent 15 years speaking more to horses than people. His ranch sat alone beneath wide western skies where the wind carried more conversations than neighbors ever could. He recognized something in the way Grace walked. She carried no destination, only distance. Her boots never searched for the smoothest trail. Her eyes never admired the sunrise painting the hills in amber light. She moved like someone trying to become invisible before the day could remember her name. Luke glanced down at the silver pocket watch resting inside his rough hand. It had stopped ticking exactly 15 years ago. He had never repaired it. Some things, he believed, deserved to remain broken. Yet that morning, for reasons he couldn't explain, he slipped the silent watch into his coat, saddled his aging bay horse, and quietly followed the lonely figure on the horizon. He stayed nearly 100 yards behind, careful not to frighten her, saying nothing as the miles slowly disappeared beneath their feet. Grace sensed him long before she turned around. She heard the steady rhythm of hoofbeats, always distant, always patient, never gaining on her. Twice she stopped beside dry creek beds. Twice the cowboy stopped too. When she crossed a narrow wooden bridge, he waited until she reached the other side before guiding his horse across the weathered planks. By late afternoon, the silence had grown heavier than the saddlebags hanging from his horse. Finally, she spun around, exhaustion and quiet frustration filling her tired green eyes. "Why are you following me?" she asked. Luke looked toward the endless road disappearing beneath the orange glow of the setting sun before answering in a voice almost carried away by the wind. "Because I've walked this road before." Grace frowned. "Then you already know it doesn't lead anywhere." The cowboy gently shook his head. "No," he replied. "It leads somewhere people believe there's no reason to come back from." For the first time that day, Grace's expression changed. Not because he had guessed where she was going, but because somehow, without asking a single question, he already knew why. Grace studied the cowboy for a long moment, searching his weathered face for pity, curiosity, or judgment. She found none of them. The wind swept across the open prairie, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant pine, while the last light of day settled over the rolling hills like a faded blanket. Neither of them spoke. The silence between strangers often felt uncomfortable, yet this silence seemed different. It asked for nothing and demanded even less. Grace turned away first and resumed walking along the dusty trail. Luke clicked his tongue softly, and his old bay horse followed at the same respectful distance. Another mile passed before the road narrowed beside a shallow creek where clear water slipped quietly over smooth stones. Grace knelt, filled her canteen, and stared into the rippling reflection without drinking. She barely recognized the tired woman looking back at her. Dust covered the hem of her dress. Loose strands of chestnut hair clung to her face, and the hopeful spark that had once brightened her green eyes seemed to belong to someone else. Behind her, Luke dismounted without a word. He let his horse drink before sitting on a fallen log, removing the silver pocket watch from his coat. His thumb rested against the scratched cover for several seconds before he closed it again. Grace noticed the motion. "Does it still work?" she finally asked. Luke gave a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. Not for a very long time. She expected him to explain, but he simply returned the watch to his pocket. They continued west as the sky slowly turned from gold to violet. The evening breeze cooled the air, and the first stars appeared above the endless horizon. Grace had spent months believing that no one could possibly understand the weight she carried, yet the quiet cowboy behind her seemed strangely familiar, as though he recognized every invisible burden without needing to hear a single word. Just before darkness settled across the valley, they reached an abandoned line shack that had survived more winters than anyone cared to count. The roof sagged slightly, but the walls still stood firm against the wind. Luke gathered a few pieces of dry cedar lying nearby and built a small fire. Its gentle glow pushed back the shadows without disturbing the peaceful silence surrounding them. Grace accepted the tin cup of warm coffee he offered, wrapping both hands around it to chase away the evening chill. After several quiet minutes, she looked toward him again. "You still have not told me why you followed me." Luke watched a single ember drift upward into the darkening sky. "Because 15 years ago," he said softly, "someone watched me walk this same kind of road." Grace waited for him to continue. Instead, he shook his head. "I did not listen then." His words lingered between them long after the fire settled into glowing coals. Grace lowered her eyes to the cup in her hands, wondering who had tried to save him, why they had failed, and why a man who believed his own time had stopped 15 years earlier was now determined to keep a stranger from reaching the end of hers. Grace slept only a few hours before the cold mountain air gently pulled her awake. The small fire had faded into glowing embers, painting soft orange light across the weathered walls of the abandoned line shack. Luke was already outside. She found him standing beside his horse, quietly tightening the saddle strap while the first rays of sunrise stretched across the prairie. He did not look toward her. He simply handed her a fresh cup of coffee, as though he had known exactly when she would wake. She accepted it with a quiet thank you, surprised by how natural those words suddenly felt. They started walking again just after sunrise. The road climbed gradually through rolling hills where patches of wildflowers swayed beneath the endless western sky. Meadowlarks sang from old fence posts. A cool breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh earth after the night dew. Everything around them seemed beautifully alive, yet Grace noticed almost none of it. Her eyes remained fixed on the trail ahead, as though every step had already been decided long before she left town. Luke never tried to change her direction. Instead, he matched her pace from a respectful distance, allowing silence to do what questions never could. By midday, they reached a weathered windmill, standing alone beside an empty cattle pond. Its blades creaked softly whenever the breeze passed through them. Grace stopped to rest beneath the shade while Luke filled both canteens from the old hand pump nearby. As he worked the handle, she noticed how carefully he measured every movement. Nothing about him felt hurried. Nothing felt forced. It was the quiet patience of a man who had spent years learning that some things could never be rushed, especially healing. Grace finally broke the silence. "Did you always live alone?" Luke paused before answering. "No." His voice remained calm. "There was laughter at my ranch once. Fresh bread every morning. Music drifting through open windows after supper. Someone always waiting on the porch when I rode home." Grace looked toward him but did not interrupt. "Then one season," he continued softly, "the house stayed exactly the same, but the laughter disappeared. I spent a long time believing the silence was all I deserved." He stopped pumping water and stared into the still surface of the bucket. "After enough years, loneliness begins to feel like another piece of furniture. You stop noticing it because it never leaves." Grace lowered her eyes. Those words settled deep inside her. She understood them better than she wished she did. They resumed walking through the afternoon until distant mountains slowly appeared against the western horizon. Grace recognized them immediately. Her breathing became slower. The canyon lay somewhere beyond those ridges. Luke noticed the subtle change in her expression, but said nothing. Instead, he reached into his coat and removed the silent silver pocket watch once more. This time Grace noticed something she had missed before. A tiny photograph rested beneath the cracked glass inside the cover. The image had faded with age, yet she could still make out a smiling young woman standing beside Luke in front of a white farmhouse. She looked happy. He looked younger. More importantly, he looked hopeful. Grace glanced up at him. "Was she your wife?" Luke smiled with quiet warmth instead of sadness. "She still is," he answered. "Love does not disappear simply because someone is no longer standing beside you." Grace felt something shift inside her heart. She had expected grief to harden a person. Instead, this lonely cowboy carried it with gentleness, as though protecting a precious memory instead of mourning a permanent loss. For the first time since leaving town, Grace wondered whether the road ahead truly held the only ending she had imagined, or whether the quiet man walking behind her had already begun changing the destination without taking a single step in front of her. The mountains grew larger with every passing mile until they filled nearly half the western sky, their blue silhouettes rising above the prairie like silent guardians that had watched generations come and go without ever speaking a word. Grace could no longer pretend she did not recognize them. Every bend in the trail felt familiar because she had chosen this destination long before she packed her small satchel and left the town behind. Luke noticed the subtle change in her pace. She no longer wandered without purpose. She walked with quiet certainty, and somehow that certainty worried him far more than confusion ever could. As the afternoon sun drifted lower, they reached an old cottonwood standing beside a narrow stream where cool water reflected strips of bright blue sky between gently moving leaves. Grace stopped beneath the spreading branches and rested one hand against the rough bark. "My father used to bring me fishing when I was little," she said without looking back. "He always told me that rivers keep moving because they never believe one bad season lasts forever." She smiled faintly before the expression disappeared. "I stopped believing that a long time ago." Luke filled both cups from the stream before sitting on a smooth stone nearby. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he listened to the water flowing around the rocks as though it might finish the conversation for him. Finally he spoke. "There was a winter when I believed spring had forgotten my ranch forever. Every fence was buried. Every field looked lifeless. I nearly sold everything because I thought nothing would ever grow there again." Grace looked toward him with quiet curiosity. "What changed?" Luke picked up a small pine cone that had fallen beside his boot. He turned it slowly in his weathered hands. "Nothing changed overnight. One morning I noticed a single green shoot pushing through the snow. It was small enough that most people would have stepped right over it. But it reminded me that seasons do not ask our permission before they change." Grace stared at the flowing stream. "People are not fields." Luke nodded gently. "No, but hearts can stay frozen just as long." They remained beneath the cottonwood until long shadows stretched across the valley. Before leaving, Grace noticed something carved into the old trunk. Two initials surrounded by a faded heart that time had almost erased. She traced the weathered marks with her fingertips before quietly asking, "Did someone carve this together?" Luke smiled. "Yes, two young people who believed forever would be easy." He looked toward the distant hills without bitterness. "They were wrong about that part. Forever is never easy." Grace lowered her hand. For the first time in months, she wondered whether memories had to become chains or whether they could become quiet companions instead. As evening approached, the trail narrowed between tall cliffs where the air grew cooler and the wind carried the scent of cedar drifting down from the higher ridges. Somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the next rise, waited the canyon she had imagined for countless sleepless nights. Luke could not see it yet, but he recognized the silence settling over Grace once more. It was heavier than before, the kind of silence that arrives when someone believes there is only one choice left. He slipped the silver pocket watch from his coat and opened it again. This time he removed the faded photograph, folded it carefully, and placed it inside Grace's hand without saying a word. She looked down at the smiling young woman in the picture, then back at Luke with quiet surprise. "Why are you giving me this?" she whispered. His answer came almost as softly as the evening breeze. "Because sometimes another person's reason to keep going becomes the bridge that carries someone else across the darkest valley. And I have a feeling tomorrow will ask both of us a question neither of us is ready to answer." I cannot honestly produce exactly 600 words without verifying the count, so I cannot claim to satisfy that precise requirement. If you are comfortable with approximately 600 words instead of an exact count, I can continue the story in the same style and format. Morning arrived beneath a sky washed pale with silver light, and the canyon finally revealed itself beyond the last ridge. Grace stopped before the narrow trail that led toward its edge. The wind rose gently through the rocks, carrying the scent of cedar and distant rain. She stood perfectly still, as though she had reached the place she had imagined through countless sleepless nights. Luke did not move beside her. He remained several yards away, giving her the same quiet respect he had offered since the moment he first followed her beyond the town limits. Neither of them spoke. The silence felt sacred now, filled not with loneliness but with understanding. Grace slowly opened her hand and looked again at the faded photograph Luke had trusted her to carry. The smiling woman inside seemed untouched by time, her eyes filled with a peace that almost reached through the worn paper itself. She must have been extraordinary, Grace whispered. Luke nodded without taking the picture back. She taught me something I never understood until she was gone, he said softly. She believed every sunrise deserved to be greeted, even after the darkest nights. Grace looked toward the canyon. What if someone cannot believe that anymore? Luke answered after a long pause. Then they borrow someone else's hope until they find their own. His words settled gently over the quiet landscape. Grace closed the watch and returned the photograph to him with careful hands. She expected him to place it back inside his pocket, but instead he tucked it into the saddlebag. Then he removed the silver pocket watch itself and held it out toward her. She stared at it in confusion. Take it, he said. It has been reminding me of the wrong thing for 15 years. Grace hesitated. It belongs to you. No, Luke replied with a faint smile. The memories belong to me. The lesson belongs to whoever still needs it. She accepted the watch. It felt heavier than she expected, warm from the palm of his hand. When she opened the cover once more, she noticed something she had never seen before. Folded behind the faded photograph rested a small piece of paper. Luke gave a quiet nod. Read it. Grace unfolded the brittle page with trembling fingers. The handwriting had faded, but every word remained clear. It read, If you ever find yourself walking through a season that feels endless, promise me you will stay long enough to see what the next sunrise becomes. Grace read the sentence again, then once more. Her breathing slowed. The wind no longer sounded empty. Somewhere high above, an eagle drifted across the brightening sky without a single hurried wing beat. She looked toward the canyon one last time, then lowered her eyes to the watch resting in her hands. For the first time since leaving town, she realized she was no longer thinking about the ending she had planned. She was thinking about a sunrise that had not happened yet, and that quiet change frightened her almost as much as it filled her with hope. Grace remained on the ridge until the sun climbed higher, warming the cool stones beneath her boots. She turned the silent pocket watch over in her hands again and again, tracing every scratch that years had left behind. It no longer felt like a broken object. It felt like a story that had survived long enough to reach someone who needed it. Luke stood beside his horse without urging her to choose one path or the other. That was the part she could not understand. Every person she had met before had offered advice, certainty, or judgment. This quiet cowboy offered only space. Somehow, that simple kindness carried more weight than all the speeches she had heard during the past year. A soft breeze drifted across the ridge, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine. Far below, sunlight shimmered across a narrow river that wound through the valley like a silver ribbon. Grace realized she had not truly looked at the landscape since leaving town. She had walked through beauty without seeing it because sorrow had narrowed her world to a single destination. Now the valley seemed impossibly wide. The mountains no longer felt like walls. They looked more like patient witnesses waiting to see what she would choose. Luke finally stepped closer, stopping several feet away. The hardest part is not turning back, he said quietly. The hardest part is believing that turning back does not mean you have failed. Grace lowered her eyes. If I go back, nothing I lost will return. No, Luke answered. But neither will anything new if you never give tomorrow the chance to arrive. She closed the watch and slipped it carefully into her coat pocket. The simple motion surprised even her. It felt less like borrowing someone else's memory and more like accepting a promise she was not yet ready to make aloud. They began walking away from the ridge together, neither one leading the other. Their footsteps fell into the same gentle rhythm as they descended the narrow trail. Every few yards Grace glanced over her shoulder. The canyon remained behind them, growing smaller with each step until it blended into the distant cliffs. She expected to feel regret. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar, fragile enough that she hesitated to give it a name. Perhaps it was not happiness. Perhaps it was only possibility. Yet possibility was more than she had carried when this journey began. As afternoon lights spread across the valley, they reached the old cottonwood once again. The carved initials on its trunk caught the sunlight, softened by years of wind and rain. Grace rested her fingertips against the weathered bark and smiled almost without realizing it. Some marks faded but never disappeared completely. Maybe people were the same. Luke noticed the faint smile, but wisely said nothing. They continued toward the open prairie where the distant outline of his lonely ranch waited beneath the endless western sky. For the first time since leaving the town behind, Grace asked a question that looked beyond the next mile. Do you think your porch still catches the sunrise the way it used to? Luke smiled with quiet certainty. Every single morning, he replied. I simply stopped sitting there long enough to notice. Grace looked toward the glowing horizon ahead, took one slow breath filled with cedar, grass, and warm summer air, and wondered if tomorrow she might be willing to watch that sunrise beside him, not because it would erase yesterday, but because it would prove that her story had not ended where she once believed it had. The return journey felt different from every mile that had come before. The same prairie stretched beneath the same enormous sky, yet nothing looked quite the same to Grace. The grass still bent with the wind, the distant mountains still rested against the horizon, and the cottonwood still cast its familiar shadow across the trail. Only her eyes had changed. She found herself noticing small things that had escaped her before. A pair of bluebirds lifting together from a fence post. Fresh hoofprints crossing the path toward a nearby creek. Sunlight dancing across tall grass as though the whole valley had decided to celebrate another ordinary morning. Luke rode beside her without speaking. He had learned long ago that peace often arrived quietly, and words spoken too soon could frighten it away. By late afternoon, the lonely ranch appeared in the distance, standing exactly as Grace imagined it from the stories he had shared. A white porch faced the western hills. A weathered barn leaned gently with age but remained strong. Split rail fences stretched across open pasture where two old horses grazed without hurry. Nothing about the place looked grand, yet everything about it felt cared for. Luke opened the ranch gate and paused. You do not owe this place anything, he said gently. You may stay one night or keep walking tomorrow. The choice will always belong to you. Grace looked at him with quiet surprise. She had expected an invitation. Instead, he offered freedom. That simple gesture touched her more deeply than she could explain. She stepped through the gate on her own, carrying the silent pocket watch inside her coat. As evening settled across the ranch, Luke lit a lantern on the porch while Grace wandered slowly through the yard. Wildflowers had grown beside the fence where no one had planted them. A wooden rocking chair rested near the front door, worn smooth by years of use. She noticed another chair standing beside it, untouched, as though someone had always believed another traveler might eventually need a place to rest. Grace smiled softly. You kept two chairs all these years. Luke looked toward the empty seat. Hope sometimes needs somewhere to sit before people are ready to join it. She laughed quietly, the sound surprising both of them. It was not a loud laugh. It lasted only a moment, yet it echoed through the still evening air like the first notes of a forgotten song returning home. Luke looked away, pretending to admire the sunset so she would not feel embarrassed. Grace sat in the empty rocking chair and watched the sky turn shades of amber, rose, and deep violet. She realized she had finally reached the end of the journey she thought she wanted. Instead of finding an ending, she had found a porch waiting for another sunrise. She slipped the silver watch into the pocket of her dress, no longer as a reminder of broken time, but as proof that even silent hearts could begin ticking again in ways no clock could ever measure. Somewhere beyond the hills, the canyon remained exactly where it had always been, unchanged and unmoving. Yet it no longer held any power over her. Tomorrow would bring ordinary chores, fresh coffee, creaking porch boards, and another sunrise over the prairie. For the first time in many months, that ordinary promise felt more extraordinary than anything she had ever imagined. Autumn arrived quietly. Across the prairie, painting the tall grass with shades of gold that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Weeks had passed since Grace first stepped through the ranch gate, yet every morning she still paused on the porch before the day began. She watched the horizon brighten exactly as Luke had promised it would. Some sunrises arrived wrapped in silver clouds. Others filled the sky with deep crimson and soft amber. None of them erased the sadness she had carried. They simply reminded her that every new day had the courage to begin again. That lesson slowly became her own. The lonely ranch no longer felt lonely. Fresh bread cooled beside the kitchen window. The old rocking chairs welcomed quiet conversations at dusk. Wildflowers bloomed along the fence where Grace carefully cleared the weeds each week. Luke repaired broken rails, mended worn saddles, and smiled more often than he realized. The silence between them remained, but it had changed. It was no longer the silence of empty hearts. It was the peaceful silence of two people who no longer needed to explain every scar they carried. One crisp morning, Grace reached into her pocket and removed the silver watch. She held it toward Luke with gentle hands. "I think this belongs on your shelf again," she said softly. He looked at the familiar scratches, then back at her. "Why?" Grace smiled. "Because it is no longer keeping my hope alive. I am." Luke accepted the watch, but instead of placing it inside the house, he set it on the porch railing where the morning sunlight touched its worn cover. The hands had never moved, yet somehow it no longer looked broken. It looked complete. A few days later, travelers passing along the old trail stopped at the ranch to ask for water before continuing west. Grace welcomed them with warm coffee and fresh biscuits while Luke filled their canteens from the well. One elderly traveler noticed the second rocking chair on the porch and asked whether someone was expected to visit. Grace looked toward the empty seat, then smiled at Luke before answering. "Someone always is." The old traveler smiled without asking another question. As evening settled across the valley, Luke and Grace sat together watching the prairie glow beneath the final light of day. The wind carried the familiar scent of cedar and dry grass across the fields. Horses grazed peacefully beyond the fence. Somewhere in the distance, meadowlarks sang their final songs before nightfall. Grace leaned back in the weathered chair and whispered, "I almost believed my story ended on that canyon trail." Luke kept his eyes on the horizon. "Sometimes," he replied, "the road we fear the most is only the road leading us home." Grace closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply as the cool evening air filled her lungs. She realized she could no longer remember the last time she wished for tomorrow not to come. Instead, she wondered what tomorrow might bring. That quiet question became the greatest gift of all. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, unchanged by their journey, yet everything inside them had changed. The canyon still existed beyond the distant hills. So did every painful memory they had ever carried. But neither of those places held the final chapter anymore. As darkness settled gently across the ranch, the porch lantern glowed beside the silent silver watch, and two empty hearts that had once wandered alone discovered that healing rarely arrives with thunder. More often, it comes as softly as another sunrise, another shared cup of coffee, another open gate, and another ordinary day that quietly becomes the beginning of a beautiful life.